Carolyn Finney is a storyteller, author, and cultural geographer, and her widely praised first book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, which was published by UNC Press in 2014, brought her to national attention as a scholar and speaker on race, belonging, environment, narrative, and place, and on whose story counts and who belongs. She is a former Fulbright scholar, and she has served on the U.S. National Parks Service Advisory Board, or just the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board. I think the service is something else. She's previously a faculty, and until very recently, a faculty member at UK, and she is now the Environmental Studies Professor of Practice in the Franklin Environmental Center at Middlebury College. She is also from closer to where I am from than anyone in this room by a matter of, I'm gonna say, at least 850 miles. So it's nice to have a neighbor here, and I'm really delighted to welcome to LFPL Carolyn Finney.
LFPL. Woo. All right. Thank you. Greetings and salutations, fine people. So this is so crazy because up until 4 weeks ago, I was living in Kentucky. And so this is my first visit back. It feels kind of weird. It's like I'm back, but not really. But I'm happy to be here. So, okay, I tend to move around a bit. So I got some things to say. Where are we? We're in October, so I think it was July. I had been invited to Tasmania, which is in Australia, and it was an Australian Geography conference, and they asked me to be the keynote, and I was like, yes, I'd never been to Tasmania. Who gets to say they go to Tasmania? I thought it was fabulous. So it was maybe 200, 300 people, predominantly white, but you had some other folks mixed in there. It's important that I say that. One of the things they did to prepare for that conference was that they had indigenous groups pass the talking stick around months in advance to actually approve whether or not we're going to have this conference, how we're going to open that conference up. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to leave that one alone for a second. I'm going to come back to, there was something else I was going to say about that. The first night they had a man, an academic, a white man named Jeff Malpass, who is a philosopher. He got up and talked a little bit about philosophy, sort of the history of it, mainstream, and so he mentioned all these people like Heidegger and Kant. And I heard like some hemming and hawing in the audience from the graduate students who were just like, oh, this is going to be the same old thing that we always do, the same old people. And even I was trying to be really open, and I was like, what's happening right now? Why is he talking about it? Because we had heard this indigenous elder before him get up, and for 15 minutes, with no apology whatsoever, he just reminded everybody what Australia has done to our Aboriginal indigenous people. And he had been invited to do so, and he did. And he was calm, but there was no apology. The children that had been stolen, the land that has been stolen, he just laid it, and everybody was frozen, because they knew it was coming, but it was just, we have to take that in. So then after him, to have this guy's philosopher got up and started talking about the history of sort of Western philosophical thought. But I was trying to follow Jeff, and right when he got to the end of his talk, he got my attention, and I think he got everybody else in the room. He started talking about, do you all remember a few months ago there was an image going around on the internet, and the image was of an immigrant father and his daughter who were crossing the border, who were found dead, face down in the river, right? And he didn't show, thankfully he didn't show the image, and I'm not going to show it either, but to remember that image. And he said, they're not just anybody. We should know the details of their lives, because that's how we attend to place. We have to be able to look at the details. And the minute he said that, everybody kind of woke up, including myself, and thinking about, wow, this is where he was kind of taking us. He was telling us all this other stuff I vaguely remember, but I've been thinking a lot about the importance of what it means to attend to place, and what does it mean to attend to details that are really hard to attend to? Because, really, we got a funky history here in the fine United States of America, right? So what does it mean for us to attend to those details? What does that look like? The other thing that I was going to say right before that, in terms of the idea of attending to place, and I meant to put this picture up while I was also thinking about this, was I'm working really hard that when I always try to thank my hosts, when I get invited somewhere, and thank the audience. But the other thing that I like to do is also to thank the American Indians in this place. But I have no relationship. I'm sad to say that I've been here 4 years. I have no relationship with the American Indians who are here. I was doing some reading, and there's supposed to be an 11,000-year history in Kentucky of American Indian presence. And so I just have to say it out loud. It's the best that I can do in any authentic way, but to call attention to that. Because for me, any conversation in this country about the environment, about land, I have to remember that all this land was stolen, all of it. And no matter how far down the road we get, right, that will always be true. So I'm also always thinking about how do we attend to that? How do I attend to that? I have notes, and then I don't pay attention to them. It's a thing. So the other thing that I do, and because I have to do it, is then tell my own story, right? When people ask me to come talk specifically about Black Faces, White Spaces, the book, and what's inside the book, the thing that I have to tell people also is that it is really strange to talk about a thing when you are the thing itself, right? It's not only, the fact that it was an intellectual exercise of research is actually really secondary. It's actually very personal. And I actually feel that it should be personal. It's personal, it's political, and it's intimate. And I actually feel it should be that way for everyone, but at least for myself, I hold that. So I always have to come into a room and tell you the story of where I'm from. If we had the time, the 3 questions I would ask everyone in this room, and a friend of mine, Sarah Pinto, gave me this idea because I heard her do it, was, where are you from, and who are your people? What's your name, where are you from, and who are your people? Right? And there's no right answer, it's just the answer that you want to tell about that. So I always have to start off with that, and this is kind of, Aaron said that we kind of grew up not knowing each other, but not far from each other, is what I always tell people, that I'm from New York, and because I am. And even though I haven't lived in New York in many, many years, I will always be from there. Something that I often say is probably 6 or 7 years ago, I was in Detroit at a street fair, and an older African-American man stopped me, and he said, "Where are you from?" Now, let me back up a little bit. People often ask me where I'm from, and because I've moved around a lot, I get a little bit of an attitude. That's what it is. And I usually say, "Do you want to know where I live, or do you want to know where I'm from?" Like, really. So I'm in Detroit, and this older African-American man asked me, "So where are you from?" And I started to get my little attitude on, "You want to know where I live, or do you want to know where I'm from?" He just looked at me like this. "You must be from New York." I was like, oh, yeah. So I try not to do that anymore and just say I'm from New York. But I want to talk about my parents first. I want to back up in Henry and Rose. Henry and Rose grew up in Floyd, Virginia. It's near Roanoke, near the Blue Ridge Mountains. They grew up poor, Black, high school education. My dad went to fight in the Korean War. When he came back from the Korean War, like a lot of Black people who lived in the South, he thought maybe if we move north, we'll get better job opportunities. They didn't have any kids yet or anything. They were thinking about that. So my father, they moved to New York because he had a sister in New York. And he got 2 job offers. One was 5 hours north of New York City, where he could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York. And one was 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County, where Aaron and I grew up. You had a very wealthy family called the Tishmans, who are still around, a wealthy Jewish family who had a 12-acre estate, which is the images you're seeing here, 30 minutes outside of New York City. A lake, a swimming pool, gardens, fruit trees, really stunning estate. They needed full-time caretakers for that property, so that's the job my parents took. My dad was the chauffeur. He was the caretaker. My mom was the sometime housekeeper, and they moved. So this was our house. It was the gardener's cottage. On the next page, I'll show you the big house. Right? It's quite lovely. Very wealthy white neighborhood. We were the only family of color in that neighborhood until the 90s. A Japanese-American woman moved in. She was there a few years, then she moved out. Harry Winston had property down the street. Wingfoot Golf Club was around the corner. For some of you older folks, you might remember Schaefer Beer. Not so good. Lived next door, right? So you start to get an idea of the wealth, the economic wealth that was in that community. My parents wanted to have kids, and they thought they couldn't have kids. My mom, like a lot of women, regardless of skin color, but I think a lot of women who come from working class backgrounds, she had gone to the doctor a few years before because she had a cyst on one of her ovaries. Without asking her permission, they put her under. Instead of just removing the cyst, they removed one of her ovaries. When she said, what you didn't tell me about that, they said, we didn't think you would be able to emotionally handle the information. Yeah, right. Unfortunately, this is not an unfamiliar story either. So my parents thought they couldn't have kids, and so it benefited me because then they adopted me. And then what I like to say is they relaxed and had my first brother. And then they relaxed some more and had my second brother. So me and my brothers on this property, the Tishmans came up on weekends and holidays. So we were always outside. It's where I learned to swim, ride my bike, all the kinds of things you learn how to do outside in the outdoors. The other story that I tell people to give you a sense of what it felt like for me to be on that property was that because you had so much wealth, there was always policemen patrolling the area. I went to a public school, Mamaroneck Public School, lots of Italian working class families, some working class African American families, and I was walking home, 4th grade, 9 years old. I had a little afro in my little school bag. I was right around the corner from the house. And a cop stopped me. He was in his car. He said, "Where are you going?" And I said, 1000 Old White Plains Road, which is the address. And he just looked at me and he said, "Do you work there?" I'm thinking, I am 9 years old, you know. But I said, I was just confused and said, "No, I live there." And he let me go. I went home. I tell my parents. My father got incredibly upset. He called the police station. He gave them holy hell. And they never bothered me or my brothers again. But as an adult, I have to reflect on that and say, what are the logics going on there? You know, maybe he should have been stopping me. Are you okay? Do I need to help get you home? You know, do you know where you're going? But somewhere in his own mind, at least through my eyes, he was trying to work out, like, what am I doing in that neighborhood because I look like me? So this idea of this beautiful sort of non-human nature, all of this happening, somehow it wasn't natural for me and my family to be in this space. I want to jump ahead to the 90s. So Mr. Tishman had passed away. Mrs. Tishman was very sick. So now my parents have been caring for this land for almost 40 years, right, full time. And to her credit, she wanted to try to find a way to keep my parents on this land because she knew she was going to die soon. Complicated. The property at the time was worth over $3 million. The property taxes alone were $125,000 a year. My father had been making about $20,000 a year. She was kind of willing to go for it, but her grown children weren't. It's a little more complicated than that. So at the end of the day, she had a house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia. It's a beautiful house. My father swore he was never moving back to the state of Virginia, but my youngest brother at this point was married with kids. That's where he was living. Me and my other brother were moving around. So it's a beautiful house on a half an acre of land. It's a complicated relationship between Mrs. Tishman and my father. She had him by her bedside when she died. But it's complicated. Our lives are really intertwined. She passed away. A new owner came on. My parents stayed on until 2003 because there have to be people full-time on this property caring for that land. Right now they've been caring for the land for almost 50 years. They found a family from the Dominican Republic who took the job. In 2003, my parents moved down to their house full-time in Leesburg. And then what I watched happen, particularly to my dad, is how depressed he got. And he was talking about missing the land. He talked about it, and he talked about it. And now he's got Alzheimer's, so it's on a loop, right, about how much he misses New York, the place, the land. And right at that point in 2003 is when it got really personal for me, because this is when I had gone back to school and I was working on my PhD, and I started thinking about that question beyond race and the environment. Whose ownership counts? Whose story counts? What do you mean black people aren't environmentalists and don't care about land? Like, I was hearing all this stuff, and I couldn't find anything on the library shelves. You know, there was some stuff on environmental justice, which is important, but black people aren't only about the bad things that happen to them in the environment, actually, like everybody else, like anybody else. Right? We have vision, we're creative, we're thinking, we've had to be thinking. That's its own story, right? And what does it mean to show up, and why aren't we seeing those stories there? And I was really watching, what really pushed me over the edge with it was that my parents showed me a letter. It was from the Westchester Conservation Land Trust. And they had sent a letter around to everybody in the area. My parents had already moved, but they got a copy of this letter sent to them. And they wanted to let everybody know that a conservation easement had been placed on this piece of property. It talked about, that means in perpetuity, nothing can be changed. It talked about the wildlife on this property, where the property sits in the watershed, the importance of protecting that property, right? At the end of this letter, which I carry around with me, it's about a page and a half long with some really beautiful photos, it thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. That's what it said. He'd been on the land 3 years. There was nothing in the letter thanking or even acknowledging my parents who had cared for the land for 50 years. And just like that, they were erased. And then I started thinking about all the people in this country, in the history of our country, who have been erased, just like that, right? And so that's why it's personal for me. I mean, at the end of the day, I love talking about all the things and taking it beyond the borders. But if I have to be really real, I'll have to say it's about making them visible, which means then I become visible, which means that my ability to see others is also expanded upon, right? So, yeah, it's kind of serious and stuff, because it is serious and stuff. So this is the driveway, which when we lived at it, it never had that gate. But when the conservation easement got placed and the new owner, suddenly there's a gate. So my family and I tried to go up this summer and get in, and we could not get on that. So we have this conversation about public lands, and I'm always asking, even though one could argue that this is private, I have an issue with that too, what public are we talking about? So this is the other thing, you know, I think I carry around a lot of different ideas, people, voices in my head when I was thinking about this conversation of race, land, ownership, belonging, because really it's also about belonging, right? It's also about who gets to say that they belong, who gets to say where they belong, right? And be attached. So lots of different kinds of people up there. Einstein, Nikki Giovanni, Cornel West, Toni Morrison, Jane Goodall, but you know, Angela Davis, what the world. And of course, the other stuff that's floating around up there we can have conversations about. And just so you know, I did always have an afro. So thinking a lot about transitions and convergence, and I always put this slide up there because I think we're always talking about that as though it's something new, and change has always been there, right? I think it's just really congested and concentrated in a very particular way. So when we're talking about environment, I side like that on purpose. I always have this at the center, right? So that's President Roosevelt, that's John Muir, it's 1903, it's Yosemite, overhanging rock. So John Muir and President Roosevelt, oh my gosh, if not the most important people in shaping the dominant narrative about the environment, they're damn near close, right? In terms of how they thought about ideas related to conservation, preservation, how we should be in good relationship with non-human nature, really shaping it in very particular ways. I imagine that to be a really amazing conversation between these two at that time. And I also have to ask the question, what else was going on in 1903? So let's go back even a little earlier than that. 1862, 52, the Homestead Act. Homestead Act, for me, the most important piece of legislation that we have had in this country. I never thought about the Homestead Act before doing this research, and it just changed my whole way of thinking about our relationship to land. Homestead Act, if you were, for the most part, a European immigrant, you know, gun went off at midnight, you could run out on a piece of land, you could put your stake down on 160 acres, and all you had to do was farm, build a home, and stay on it for 5 years. If you did that, the land was yours free and clear. Free and clear, right? And you know, I'm not taking anything away from European immigrants. Many of them had to leave a home that they didn't want to leave because they were having problems there. I get that. I also get that something like 60% of them didn't survive, didn't make it, because it's really lonely. You could die from the common cold. Your closest neighbor would be 100 miles away. I can't imagine how hard it'd be to start a new life in a place that was predominantly wilderness, as we think about it, wild outdoors, right? Having to do that. But I also have to ask, who was on that land before they got here that had to be removed and or killed in order for that land to be available? And oh yes, 3 years later, we had the Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved Africans are freed. They're given 400,000 acres until a bunch of white plantation owners, I'm sorry, sat down and said, oh my God, we just gave people that we enslaved 400,000 acres of land, and land isn't only about land. It is about political and economic power. It is about legacy. It is about the right to say, I belong here. My family belongs here. I'm part of the soil. And they took all that land right back. And for the most part, they were not allowed to participate in the Homestead Act, happening at the same time, right? So by the time you get to 1903, and they're having this pretty amazing conversation, Jim Crow is firmly in place. So I'm here to tell you, it doesn't matter if it was a beautiful beach, a beautiful forest, beautiful parkland. If you were non-white, black, Asian, native, just go on down the line, you did not have the right or the ability to move through space in these beautiful green spaces in the same way. It's an ugly and hard thing to say, but it is also the truth, right? And it didn't matter universally what we were talking about, in terms of how we should be able to be with nature. If you were non-white, you couldn't do it. You couldn't do it right up to 1964. And arguably after that, you still couldn't do it because it just depended on what part of the country you lived in. And that's just a fact that's really hard to hold, because often in the environmental movement, there's this wonderful aspiration of, wow, we can be one with nature. We're going to care for nature out there because it's going to care for us, and this is how we're going to be. And somehow we can skip over all this other stuff that we've done to each other through our differences and just get to that. And I'm here to say we can't do that well. We can't do it right unless we're real with each other about how are we in relationship with each other around these ideas of nature and everything else for that matter. It's revving up. There's going to be funny stuff, I promise. But we've got to get the hard stuff out there first. Yes. Again, not following my notes. Oh, yes, convergence. I always ask, what is it that we're trying to sustain? We say sustainability. Sustainability is one of those words that kind of make me a little nuts, because not because of what the intention behind it, but because actually, after a while, if we went around this room and I asked each of you what you thought it meant, we'd have so many different definitions of what that means, right? And I think it's so important for us to challenge what that is. So I wanted to write the book. I wanted to do this research. I wanted to talk to Black people around the country and find out what they're thinking about in terms of these ideas of environment and place and parks and ownership and public lands. And I am not speaking for all African Americans. This is just something that I sort of put together based on my perspective. That's something else I usually say at the beginning, that I believe all knowledge is subjective. We bring all of who we are to bear upon anything it is we're trying to understand. Everyone in this room, including myself, is biased, right? Bias isn't a bad thing. It's just that we are, right? So sometimes I also tell that story, so when I come here and say all these things that I've been thinking about to you, that you understand in part, why I feel this way about these things, and hopefully to get you to think about that as well, if you haven't, for your own life. So I purposefully named most of the chapters after Spike Lee movies. In part because I pushed back on the idea within an academic setting that the best knowledge, the only knowledge, is the knowledge gained from a formal education in an academic setting. Because if it's true, then a lot of people who see themselves differently in the world, who are not on the library shelves, then don't count. And the way they experience and know life doesn't count. And I wanted to push back on it and say, yes, there's some great research being done. I'm all about science. Please do not misunderstand what it is I'm saying here about that. But I'm also all about art and poetry and memoir and story and oral history and the way people show up and tell their story over and over again, even if the world isn't listening. And so I wanted to use Spike Lee. Bamboozled, I don't know if you've seen Bamboozled, was really talking about the American media and the way we've been bamboozled around African-American stereotypes. For me, it was really about the dominant narrative about the environment in this country, this kind of idea that it was largely manifest destiny, the idea that we had a right as human beings to kind of move across the country, and we, and I say this gently and softly, we meaning the European immigrants, right, not everybody else, to move across the country to settle and to make a life. We have a right to do that. It's not that that's untrue, but that's not the whole truth of what everybody else was experiencing at the same time. And even I would argue that for many of the European immigrants, because they came in contact with others as well. So it changes the way they also interacted and thought about this. Have you seen the movie Far and Away with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman? Did you like it? Yeah, me too. But what I like about the movie is that it's a story about Irish immigrants coming to the United States. Nicole Kidman plays a wealthy one. Tom Cruise plays a poor one. And at the very outset of the movie, Tom Cruise's father in the movie is dying and says land is the most important thing, right? And in the last 20 minutes of the movie, there's a depiction of what it must look like when that gun went off at midnight and everybody went running out. And people were vicious to get that 160 acres. And it was the first time I'd seen what it might have looked like and how hard it might have been at that time. I always like to put this one up because I rolled that way. So Jungle Fever, Spike Lee was talking about interracial relationships. And I was thinking about, in terms of the way that nature has been constructed in this country, the way we, in terms of the dominant narrative we talk about it, what does that mean when we talk about black people? Because it gets really complicated historically when you start talking about the eugenics movement. If you start talking about the World's Fairs, right? So I'm going to talk about this in a second. The World's Fairs of the 1800s and early 1900s must have been cool for some people because it was really about how we can be creative, innovative, where are we going? But there was this idea that we're kind of, close to God, we're going to be moving this way, right? Up, right? They would have people of color in cages as examples of the things we want to move away from. Native people, black people. One of the stories that I often tell, and unfortunately there are too many of these stories, is the story of Otabanga. Otabanga was 19. He was discovered in the Congo. He was brought back here to the United States, and they put him on display at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. That is my favorite museum. It's the first museum I've ever gone to. As a kid, I went there a lot because they thought he represented the missing link. And because they didn't think enough of the public would see him, they moved him to the primate exhibit at the Bronx Zoo until enough people protested and they stopped. But that's just one of many, many stories of this. Black people close to nature becomes a complicated thing to talk about historically, right? Because we were seen as less than human, so what does that mean? So let's jump ahead to 2009, 2010, Vogue magazine. It's the first time an African-American man has been put on the cover. So they put on LeBron James, right? Supermodel Gisele Bündchen. When this came out, a lot of people, black people on the internet, got incredibly upset. Because they said, well, it's the first time you put a black man on the cover, and why is he looking so, why couldn't he be more elegant or in a suit or something? Then somebody uncovered this picture. This picture is from 1917, this poster, right down to the color of her dress. Now, the editor said they didn't know anything about that poster. I'm not exactly believing that, right? But okay. But it still says something about what's embedded in our consciousness collectively about black people. I think about when President Obama, as the first self-identified African-American man to be elected president, what happened when he became president, when you start looking at things in the press, in the media, things that were being said, when Glenn Beck, who's a conservative talk show host, started talking about Obama's Planet of the Apes. When Sean Delonis of the New York Post, he draws cartoons, and when the stimulus bill came out, he drew a big cartoon of a dead chimpanzee, stimulus bills pinned to his chest, two white cops with a smoking gun standing over him. And it goes on. You could go through the internet. Actually, they're not outliers. The conversation changed. And I would say, actually, because that's what's always been there, right? So now, if we jump ahead, why do so many people get upset about this? This is why so many people got upset. It's a sensitive topic, and it's really important to say LeBron agreed to this, and I'm pretty sure he got paid. I read something that he had actually done a whole bunch of different pictures. So his complicity is in there too, and I'm not trying to say anything bad about LeBron. I'm just saying it's important to say that he bears some responsibility because he's not exactly a man without power here. But to understand how complicated the issue of representation is. I often, 1964, I was really small, but I kind of remember the Civil Rights Act because in the most vague way, because I was, black parents who were thinking about, this means maybe more equality, really broadly what it is. What I didn't know until I was doing this research, that the same year was the Wilderness Act. I never thought about the Wilderness Act. It just never crossed my mind. They both happened in the same year, also two very important pieces of legislation. And when you read them, it's really interesting on both accounts. Howard Zahnizer and his people who wrote the Wilderness Act are incredibly thoughtful, put in a lot of time, but they used a lot of universal language about what we should be able to do, and how we should be the universal we. It was 1964 that I mentioned Jim Crow segregation. I know that they were meaning well, but how did they jump over all that stuff that was happening? And I'm only talking about African Americans, right? I'm not talking about American Indians. I'm not talking about all the diverse Asian population. I'm not talking about Latinx. I'm not even bringing in everybody else. who was having all kinds of issues trying to be here and be whole at the same time on this land, and still are, right? How do we hold that? And just to bring the point home, when I was working on this research, a Canadian friend sent me an article. And the article was written about a white professor at Boston College, late 50s, who had, I was friends with this African-American couple. And they wanted to go to a national park. But this was like late 50s, early 60s. They're black, so they thought, you know what, let's not go to a national park in the United States. Let's go over the border to Fundy Bay National Park in Canada. And he said, good idea. Let me write the superintendent and just make sure he knows you're coming so you're treated well. He had to wait a while before he got a response. And finally, he got a response from the superintendent who said, sorry it took so long to reply. And I'm sorry to tell you that I can't make that guarantee that your friends will be treated well. And the professor had written him and said, they're educated, they're, well-cultured. I just want them to be treated with respect. And he said, I can't make that promise to you because we get a lot of American visitors here. The couple was Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, who wanted to take a break from the civil rights work to go find that spiritual renewal in the woods that Howard Zahniser and his people were talking about in the Wilderness Act. This is how it gets complicated, right? Even with their fame, they weren't able to do that. Yes, it is like that. One of the things that really came up was I always say I like that picture of Tupac, was the power of memory, especially when I'm talking to older black folks, that it came up over and over again in terms of thinking about their own experience, thinking collectively about their experience, and their relationship to institutions in this country, academic, political, the lack of trust, right, with those institutions in this country. Two stories I want to tell you. The first is a personal one with my dad. So 2005, I was living in Atlanta for a year. And I got my parents to come visit me, and I said, okay, this was huge because they never come visit me anywhere. And I was like, we're going to have a black experience. We're going to go to Dr. Martin Luther King National Park, which is right in downtown Atlanta. People live on the street. Ebenezer Baptist Church is on that street. The house Dr. King grew up in is on that street. There's a visitor center. It's just alive, right? My dad, Henry Lee Finney, is what he was born. Is really old school. He's old school, doesn't show, for me, from my perspective as his daughter, didn't show a lot of emotion. He scared me. He was kind of stoic and domineering, seemed angry a lot, kind of scared me just a bit. Though I want to say one of the coolest things that my father ever did, so he was born Henry Lee Finney, and he was sure that Lee was after Robert E. Lee, which really upset him. So around 2000, he asked me and my brothers, he said, do you think I could change my name? And we said, yeah, you can do it. Here's what you got to do. This is the paperwork you got to get. He changed his name. It is now Henry X. Finney. I'm like, Dad, that was cool. So me and my dad, my mother Rose, we go into the visitor center, which was a whole bunch of dioramas at the time. It had images from the 50s and 60s, sounds coming over the speaker of Dr. King's voice and police, and just your senses were inundated with things you were seeing from that period of time. There were live statues of people marching. There was a replica of the jail cell Dr. King must have spent time in. It was just like all of that. And my mother had kind of wandered off, and me and my dad were standing in front of one of these dioramas. And the thing I want to tell people is, like, we did not have a touchy-feely existence. This was pre-Cosby, pre-Oprah. I mean, not 2005, but when I grew up, like, none of that was there. So it was very, we're all very self-contained. So I'm standing next to my dad. I'm going to borrow your arm for a second. And my dad grabs my arm, and he grabs it hard, right? And suddenly I was like 10 again. I'm like, I did something wrong, but I'm like, grown, what's happening right now? And I looked at him, and he had blanched. And I thought what was happening now, he's having a heart attack, because I got really scared. And all this happened really fast, right? And then the next second, he kind of giggled, which was some really weird stuff, because if you know my dad, giggling is not in his thing, right? And then he pointed, and what he pointed to, there was an image, and it was an image of a sign that said, "For whites only." He pointed to the sign, he said, I saw that sign, and for a moment, I thought we weren't supposed to be here. So what he was doing was his instinct was grab my daughter, we got to get out. But it was the first time in my life with him that I recognized what he was carrying around all the time, and all that other stuff on top that was driving me crazy, right? I said that he keeps that suppressed, and it caught him. It caught him off guard, and all the vulnerability was right there. That memory that we carry in our DNA, we carry it in our subconscious. So all the stuff we put outside of that, when you live in a world that hasn't collectively dealt with it in a way that really serves, it finds a way of coming out. He had a great time that day. That's the other thing I want to tell you about that story. He said, actually, he wasn't expecting to have a good experience, but I think it's because he felt really seen and really present in that moment. The other way that I felt memory gets used a lot is African Americans who use it in terms of their own activism and their environmental activism. And I always love to talk about her because she's one of my favorite people. Have any of you heard of the beach lady, Maureen Betch? What? None of you can go home. All right. Now, her sister is very famous, is Jonetta Cole. She's a well-known, right, African-American academic. I think she's on the board at the new African-American Smithsonian Museum. She's done a lot of things. Maureen grew up in a very wealthy black family on Amelia Island off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida. This was in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Her great-grandfather, A.L. Lewis, was the first man, black or white, to have a life insurance company in Jacksonville. So that's how they made their money. But this was the 1940s. They were in Florida. It didn't matter how much money you had, you could not go to the same beach as white people. So A.L. Lewis said, we can't go to the same beach. We're going to buy a beach. So they bought a beach on Amelia Island. It's called American Beach. You could be a black janitor. You could be a black judge. You could have a fine little modest home on the beach. Those are the sand dunes in the background. So this is where Maureen grew up. Maureen went to Oberlin College. She decided she wanted to be an opera singer, so she went to Germany for a number of years. And she had some success. But sometime in the 70s, she became interested in environmental causes. So first, with her money, she would support, there was a man who was studying the monarch butterfly, and so she was like his patron. She would give her money to groups that were going to Africa and working with pygmy communities. This is what she told me. She came back to the United States. She gave all her wealth away to environmental causes, all of it, over $750,000. The house that had been bequeathed to her from her great-grandfather, she gave away to environmental causes. She was living on a chaise lounge on the beach. I asked Maureen, I said, weren't you concerned? You're like on a chaise lounge? She said, no, I had a big stick. Her sister, Jonetta, got her a trailer, which she moved into, which she promptly turned into kind of like a mini museum. The thing Maureen said that happened was, before she'd been focused out here, like all this big environmental stuff happening, and she started looking at what was happening on Amelia Island. They were on prime beachfront property. American Beach sits in between two beach resorts, Fernandina Beach Resort and Amelia Island Plantation. It's got a maritime forest. It's really lovely. So of course developers are like, yeah, it's really lovely. Think of the next hotel, the next golf course, all this kind of conversation that was happening. And this is the thing that Maureen decided she was going to fight. And so all the stories that she tells me, the one I most like to tell audiences, that she said she'd go to these civic meetings. Now, this is Maureen's hair. Maureen's dreads were so long, that's what she's carrying in the net, right? You ain't missing Maureen if she walks in a room. But she told me she'd go to a civic meeting, maybe in a room like this, and she said, I'd come up behind, and they'd be doing the Pledge of Allegiance. And she says, and I'd join in. I pledge of allegiance to the flag, to the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. And then she shouted at the top of her lungs, for all white people who got money. And then she'd be like, and then they heard me, and I'm like, they heard you when you came in. She worked with the Park Service to protect 8.2 acres of the sand dunes. There's been a movie made about her. There's been books written about her. She's gotten awards. What's so interesting to me is also who we talk about and what stories we tell, right? And this has been a number of years. Maureen passed away in 2005, right after Hurricane Katrina hit. So she hasn't been with us. And I go all over the country, and this isn't on anyone, it's on everyone. Like, why we haven't been, this isn't a black or white, brown, this is an amazing story of commitment. Why aren't we telling this story? Why? Righteous road, right? Oh, so here I go, it's not easy being green, this is what I call it. I talk about the challenges of, for me, you can't separate out. I know this sounds really simple, but you can't separate out race in the environment. Race isn't a conversation, and racism and inequality and justice around it isn't a separate conversation, because we would all die, right, if we don't have, nature out there in all its forms, right? And I put it's not easy being green, thinking of Kermit, but also it gets complicated when half the time you show up, but you're invisible in the room. It gets complicated when your story isn't on the shelf and you have to prove that your story is true, but you need the stories on the shelf to back up your story that your story is true, but the stories aren't on the shelf. It gets complicated when really good people with really good intentions start really good environmental organizations where pretty much everybody looks more or less the same in terms of their cultural experience, knowing that everybody is different. Whiteness is also diverse. I understand that. I'm sort of simplifying it to make the point. If you're African American, the challenges you face showing up in a room. So, this was about 2005, 2006. Garrison Institute is a beautiful place in upstate New York on the Hudson. It used to be a monastery. Now, if you have some kind of environmental meeting, they'll allow you to come in with your people and spend a few days and talk about stuff. You just need to have some kind of spiritual component, but you can do the thing. Right, and so someone called me up, it was kind of last minute, and they said, Carolyn, this is invitation only, 40 people running environmental organizations and academic institutions. We're coming together to talk about how we can make the environmental movement more progressive, more diverse. Would you like to come? Because I was working on this, I was like, everything is going to be some information. I'm going to show up. Didn't really think too hard about it. So I get there. There's 40 people, and the first night, we're all sitting around in a big circle. There's a big gold Buddha behind us. And I'm looking around the circle, and I'm the only person of color in the room. This is going to be a 3-day event. And then I had that moment when I'm like, I can't leave now. Okay. And I'm a student at the time, so regardless of whatever my age was, there was one other student in the room, and I was looking at people. I was like, that's so-and-so from the so-and-so organization. I'm looking at who people are, and I'm going, oh my God. They start doing the introductions, and somehow it started over here to my left, which meant that I was going to be one of the last people. I'm just sitting there going, I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't know. How am I? The elephant's in the room. What's happening? It gets to me, and I do some half. It was like fairly lame, but I said something to the effect of, it's just me here, what's going on right now. And the only person to respond was a dude from Scotland who went, right on, sister. I'm not making it up. And I'm like, nobody else is saying anything. Over the course of the next 3 days, they said, let's break up into groups and we need to have conversations about what it is we're going to be doing here to make the environmental movement more progressive and diverse. Carolyn, can you run the group on racism, homophobia, sexism? Because I swear to you, and I looked and I went, oh, okay, I can do it for today. I'm thinking, I can do it. Over the next 3 days, they asked me to run that group. Now, I wanted to go to, there was something on soil and soul that sounded like it amazing, but I couldn't go to anything else because I had to run the group on racism, homophobia, sexism, on down the line. Now, I'm not saying I got it all, I don't need any work. I have to say, and this maybe shows a lack of humility on my part, I was probably the last one in the room who needed to be in the group for 3 days in a row, right? By the third day, they said, okay, we're going to figure out which groups, what was the most important topics, right? And everybody raised their hand or stand up and come over if this is a group. And somebody said, the racism, homophobia, sexism group. And there was a white guy, I remember Andy Gray, he came over and sat by me, and nobody else came over. A white man who was running everything stood up and said, Carolyn, there's nobody really over here. Just join us over here in communications. Yeah, I wasn't in there because then I lost it. I did the thing you never want to do. I became all the things. I lost it. I lost it. I was crying. I was angry. I lost it because it had been going on for 3 days and all these people were so much more powerful than me in their position, and I let it go on too, right? yes, I didn't know what to do or how to do it, but 3 days, right? And you talk about the room freezing, the room froze. And I was like, ah, ah, ah. Then we all kind of parted. We all took me on the corner, we're talking through it. They said, let's come back together. And they're like, well, Carolyn, you don't have to run this now. I said, I know, but actually I have to now because it's on. We went around the circle, and I said everything that I saw happening for 3 days. And then everybody in that circle went around going, I saw it happening, and I just wanted to ignore it. I saw it happening, and I didn't want to be uncomfortable. And so the truth, it just came out. A beautiful moment was there were Buddhist practitioners, teachers in the room. Grown men was crying because they realized, I said, you're Buddhist. What's going on right now? You messed it up for 3 days, For me, it was the best part of the conversation, but it was at the end, right? So it's also that thing of who do we expect to hold that, and how do we hold that? Yeah, I'm just going to leave that like that. Just because I like to tell the story and I never know quite where to fit it in, but it's also in the book, is because I like to talk a lot about John Francis, maybe with the meditation piece. John Francis? We got a couple people in the room. Planet Walker? Okay, this dude. Yes. And he's taking notes, so I know. Okay. John Francis grew up in Northern California. In the 70s, that's where he was living. There was a small oil spill at the time. He got really upset by that oil spill, so he said, I'm not going to take any motorized transport. He said, it was no plan. He said, I'm just not going to take any cars or trucks. I'm just going to walk everywhere. And when you do something really different than what your friends and family are doing, how they try to get you to do what they're doing. So every time somebody would try to get him to get in their car, and he would explain, he said, I'd get in a fight with them, so I just stopped talking about it. For the next 22 years, John walked across the United States and Latin America to raise awareness about the environment, and he did it for 17 years without talking. Right. He got his PhD at the University of Wisconsin without talking. Yeah, that's what I said, because I was like, I couldn't do it. John said that maybe late 80s, early 90s, it was right after Exxon Valdez happened in 89. He was talking, but still only taking no motorized transport, working on a friend's boat in New England. He got a call from some folks in Washington, D.C., who said, we need you to come down and interview for this position because we have no oil spill policy. He was the only PhD in the country who'd done a PhD on oil spills, right? They had him. They wanted him to come down. They were like, we'll send you a plane ticket. He's like, I don't take a plane. We'll send you a train ticket. I don't take a train. I don't bus ticket. I don't take the bus. They're like, how are you going to get here? He said, I'll ride my bike. How long is that going to take? He said, a month. They waited. He rode. He interviewed. He got the job. So he's one of our early architects around our early oil spill policy. He started an organization called Planet Walk. He took a group of people to Cuba to set up satellite systems for kids in Cuba, so kids in America and kids in Cuba could be talking to each other about questions like sustainability. John told me that somewhere in the 90s, somebody from National Geographic approached him when he was still walking and not talking, and said this would be a great story for National Geographic, which seems right? Because National Geographic, people are doing all kinds of crazy stuff. They're, spelunking and taking boats around the world. He said a week later, the guy came back to him with his head hung down in kind of shame and said, I'm sorry, I took the idea to the board about having this big story on you. And basically the way John interpreted it was, we don't want a story about a crazy black man who spent 22 years walking across the U.S. to raise environmental awareness, 17 years without talking. So what they did is they put a little story at the back of it. Now, jump ahead to 2002, 2003, John decides he wants to write the story Planet Walker about his story, but can't find anybody to publish it. Because we have so many stories about black men spending 22 years walking across the United States to raise environmental awareness, 17 years without talking. National Geographic, he publishes it, self-publishes it, comes out, they find out. They said, you know what, we're going to do it. We're going to publish it. He's now a National Geographic fellow. They send him around the world. Hollywood bought the rights to the story. They still haven't done anything with it. At the time he told me this, it was like Will Smith. Now we've kind of moved on from Will, but of who might play, Yeah. I saw that. Often when I tell audiences that, Hollywood's talking about making a movie about his story, they say, Hollywood's going to mess it up because they mess up these kind of stories. And I say, I'm sorry. When is the last time you've seen a movie about a black man who spent 22 years walking across the United States to raise environmental awareness, 17 years without talking? I don't care who makes the movie. That's right. just as long as the movie gets made, because people will come to see whoever Elijah for, whoever's playing him in the movie, right? But they'll also see somebody who looks like him, whose commitment is 100% and then some, right? In terms of what he thinks about the environment, what he's doing. And why aren't we telling that story? Why aren't we telling that story? I'm almost at the end. Oh my God, so close. So in the last chapter of the book, when I turned this into a book, when I was still in sort of full-time academia, thinking that I wanted tenure, that's its own conversation about looking like me, having these conversations about the environment. You have to get it had to be with an academic press, and you have to have reviewers review it. And it's supposed to be like you don't know who the reviewers are. So it got sent out. The universe has its way, right? So I happen to know there were 2 men, 1 black and 1 white. I knew who they both were, great scholars, both of them, thoughtful, good people who I supported. And they did their work. Gave me a lot of feedback. The white scholar gave some feedback that I didn't agree with, but he said, why don't you write a chapter about all the fear that African Americans feel about nature and the environment? Now, you have to understand that throughout the book, I talk about lynching. Do you see how I'm talking about it here? I talk about it there too. So it's like I do talk about it. But I did not want to write an entire chapter about how much fear we felt. Does anybody have a copy of my book? Where's Aaron? Did I see somebody with something in there? Can I borrow that for a second? Sorry, wasn't going to do this, but look at me just being like that because, thank you. So I had too much, because when you don't agree on something, you have to come up with your argument about what you're going to do. And so in the last chapter, I spend a page talking about it. I called the Sanctified Church after Zora Hurston. And I quoted a chapter from Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary, whose book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome is pretty amazing. If you ever get a chance to hear her speak, she's amazing. And here's what she writes. It's just one paragraph. 180 years of the Middle Passage, 246 years of slavery, rape, and abuse, 100 years of illusory freedom, black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow, all codified by our national institutions. Lynching, medical experimentation, redlining, disenfranchisement, grossly unequal treatment in almost every aspect of our society, brutality at the hands of those charged with protecting and serving. Being undesirable strangers in the only land we know. During the 385 years since the first of our ancestors were brought here against their will, we have barely had time to catch our collective breath. That we are here at all can be seen as a testament to our willpower, spiritual strength, and resilience. I spent the rest of the chapter talking about our resilience because I thought that's where the value is, not only for black people, but for everybody, right, in terms of the wider conversation. Thank you for that. I love that you were there. That was perfect. We could travel together and stuff. Yeah, excellent. So one of those people that I always like to talk about is Brenda Barbour. Brenda Barbour is originally from Denver. This was now probably 10, 15 years ago. She got a call from some folks in Chicago who said, can you come help us out in Chicago? We have a lot of previously incarcerated black men and women who can't get a job. And maybe you can help us think about what would be really good for them to be doing. And so she said, okay, I'll come, but I'll have to come and move there and get to know the community. But yes, let's do it. They came up with landscape gardening. Not bad. Well, she didn't think it had legs, but not bad. Driving around the elderly, also not a bad idea. Then she had a random conversation with a friend of hers who was talking about beekeeping. I mean, entirely random. It had nothing to do with what she's supposed to be doing. And she said, that's what we're going to do. We're going to make urban honey on the west side of Chicago. And everybody thought she was kind of crazy. She said, it's the west side of Chicago after all. And she has a successful business. It's called Sweet Beginnings. They make honey and honey-related products. It's off the charts, right? The story that I like to tell about her is when she interviews one of these young men or women for the job, right? So everybody who gets a job there, including her, has to know the life cycle of the bee. Also, I should tell you, she said she didn't realize for a year that she was running a green business. She didn't even know what that meant, except somebody told her, oh, you don't feed your bees sugar derivatives, you're acting locally, like they were spelling it all for her. She's like, oh, okay, I'm writing the green. She was just intuitively doing these things. But then she'd interview one of these young men or women, and she'd say, hi, so you'd like a job? They say, yes. So you were in jail? Yeah. Well, and they say, yes. And she said, so what were you in jail for? And they'd usually say something like, well, I was selling drugs. And then she'd do a kind of pause. So were you good at it? And usually they'd say, yeah, until I got caught. And then she'd ask them, well, what were you good at? And then they would say, well, I knew about the quality of my product. I understood my customer base. And everything that they rattled off, she said, that stuff is all transferable to this legal thing of making honey and working with the bees, right? And the reason I like to tell audiences this is twofold, is one, nobody is an empty vessel, right? I tell people, they hear me say this all the time, I never use the term outreach anymore. You know what, outreach, I understand the intention of outreach. As somebody who's been outreached to, I know it comes most of the time from a really good place. But here's what outreach means to me. I'm gonna stick out, hi, how you doing? So it's like I'm outreaching to you, right? So it's so nice to meet you. And I bring you over here to my table, and I make room for you, and I put you down there in a chair. And then you have to learn everything about the table. You have to learn everything about the table. You have to learn everything about everybody at the table. And we actually don't need to know anything about you. Nothing at the table actually changes. We've just made a little more space, right? So this whole idea that we want something different and we're doing the same old thing, right, really doesn't play out. I'm interested in a relationship of reciprocity and the recognition that what you bring is a whole world of experience. It may mean that you have the next good idea, which may mean that we have to overturn the table, which may mean that we have to get rid of all the chairs because anyway, the whole idea of the table isn't a good idea. It may mean we have to change everything. And this is the place where I find the resistance because you know what? It also means it's about giving up power, recognizing privilege, and maybe letting go of some of that. And I know that it's hard to do. It's hard to do, right? Everybody in this room has privilege. Me too. We don't all have the same privilege at the same time in the same way, right? We all have power too, but that's complicated in terms of what kind of power we're talking. When we talk about the environment, what narratives, I work with a lot of good people in a lot of these big organizations. And I also want to say that they hold on to those mission statements from 50 years ago. Did I remind people what was happening 50 years ago? Okay. It's like, it's not about forgetting what came before. It's not to say there isn't some value in what came before, but this is where we are now, right? How do we deal with issues of reconciliation, reparations, maybe giving all the land back? Ask some American Indians. They would tell you decolonization is not just an idea. It's about give us the land back. I'm not saying that's what we should do, but we should be having that conversation, because that's reflective of our past and how we're here now. How do we move forward in trust with each other, in good relationship, not in agreement with each other, right? That's a whole different thing for me. But how do we move forward in trust with each other? So the last thing I want to say, for myself, but also for others, is kind of this question of sustainability is the work there. The primary reason really, I tell my own story in part to situate myself so you understand my own bias and my own perspective. But it's also to remind everybody, first and foremost, I'm human, just like everybody else, right? That we're all at the base of it, at the foundation, we're human beings. We're human beings who are all different, in different ways that we show up. And I do not want to forget my own humanity in that. So these two stories, this is Ian Gibson. Ian Gibson was 53 at the time. This is probably 5 years ago. You may not remember the story of Ian Gibson. Ian Gibson was a sport hunter who went to South Africa to sport hunt elephants. The story that really hit the news about 6 months after him was the American dentist who killed the lion, the Cecil or whatever. But before that was Ian Gibson. And he went sport hunting. He was with black Africans, white Africans. They were out. He got too close to a young bull elephant and he got gored to death. I was reading about this online, and as I'm reading about the story, you should know that I love elephants. I really have a hard time understanding the value of sport hunting. Just saying it for me. My dad collects guns. I mean, but I have my own issues there. But when I got to the end of the article and I started reading all the comments, and that just went on and on. I was in tears by the end, because every single comment, save for one, said things like, he got what he deserved. One for the elephant. And it was brutal. And I kept thinking, this man has a family. This man came from a community. Those last moments in his life, I still think about it going, I can't imagine what must have been going through his head, that in that moment he wasn't expecting to die and he was dying in that moment. And the best we can do is say he got what he deserved. And now we want to have a conversation about sustainability. If we don't attend to our relationships, I'd be more interested in having a conversation with him about what he's doing. I don't know that I'd ever agree with him about it, but maybe we could have a wider conversation about it, because sport hunting is also part of conservation. It's complicated, right? But I'm not interested in losing my humanity just because he's doing something that I don't like. How do we get better at that? I put it up next to this picture because this is a lot easier for me. This little boy, it was related to a story about Flint, Michigan, and the lead in the water. So it's an easier thing. My empathy, easy. He's a young child. He's African American. He had nothing to do with that lead being put in the water. We have no idea what kind of impact this is going to have on his life, right? And all the other children of all colors who are going to be affected who live in Flint. That's not where I have to do my work. This is where I have to do my work. And so what I sort of say to everybody is, in terms of what risks are we willing to take, right? What risks are we willing to take in order to gain? Not because we're afraid of losing. We often take risks because we don't want to lose that thing, but what does it mean to take a risk in order to gain? And it is not about being comfortable. It is never about being comfortable. So many of us are never comfortable, right? So a couple of years ago, Svetlana Alexievich won the Nobel Prize for her work on Chernobyl. She's from Belarus. And I listened to a show on NPR with Michelle Martin, and she got a lot of her people in Belarus mad at her government, her people, because, she basically laid out the dirty laundry to the rest of the world about what happened at Chernobyl. And Michelle Martin asked her, she said, well, you made a lot of people uncomfortable. Don't you feel bad about that? She basically said, I'm not interested in making people comfortable, but I love my people. I want them to be better, right? So I guess that's where I want to end and say that is think about how we're better. I usually end with two quotes, I will. One is Albert Einstein. I should know this by heart, but I always have to look at it again because Einstein's smart, and if I get it wrong, then it's like messed up. You can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. You can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. For me, we can have all the steps we want about how we're going to do these things differently, but if we haven't done that digging deep, we have to do that at the same time, and there is nothing easy about it, and there's nothing clean about it. But I think there's a lot of promise there. The quote I prefer instead is Moms Mabley, who's a well-known black vaudevillian comedian, who said it, if you always do what you always did, you always get what you always got. I'll stop there. Thank you. You're so sweet. Oh, you don't have to stand. You don't have to stand. So this is where, your turn. And there's no right way. I really am curious what you're thinking. You don't have to agree what to say. Really, it's just a way to have a conversation. For me, this is almost my favorite part of the whole thing, because I don't know what's coming. Yes. And say your name. Yeah, I'm sorry. You got to say your name today.
Okay. My name is Rachel T. Smith, and I work for Louisville Metro Government with Air Pollution Control District. Some of my people are in here. And I really appreciate seeing the Cornel West quotes in his picture, because he's here, and he's going to be at the ADOS conference tomorrow at my church.
Oh, wow.
And ADOS is about reparations. Okay. It's about reciprocity. It's the American descendants of slavery. And so people are going to be here from all over the country. So it's inspiring to hear you, and it helps in healing when you hear somebody else say, oh, wow, this is the most black people I've seen here, and this is the youngest black people I've seen here. And it's like, well, it's all about access and information. Mm-hmm. So, and it is a struggle to give up that privilege. Yeah. And so I thank you for what
you're welcome, Rachel. Yeah. Don't be shy. I know this is like the warm-up period. I'm trying not to look at you. The teacher in me is like, but I'm trying to just be, relaxed. Oh, yes. And just don't forget to say your name, please.
My name's Ray Taylor.
Hey, Ray.
And I have a question about how we're polarized now in our society and what would be best to eliminate that.
Now, I thought you was my friend, Ray. What's going on? If I know, you set me up. I do believe time's up. Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, wow. Okay. Let me. Woosah. So, in no apparent order. Oh, okay. Okay. You want me to go first, or you want to go? Okay. Yes. Yes, we need to listen to each other. So, yes, we need to listen to each other. When I put up my metaphorical afro and I had lots of different people up there, so one of the people I had up there was Liam Neeson. And if you remember, a few months ago, there was a whole little thing, Liam Neeson, talked about, 20, 30 years ago when a white woman friend of his got raped by a black man, and he admitted on live whatever when he was going to interview that he was so mad he was going to go out and kill him, a black person, and he said it out loud. And then also he talked about how he realized, oh my God, later on, whatever. He said some stupid things, and then he worked on it. And then what generally happened, what I saw in the media was, oh, Liam Neeson's off the list. So this is, okay, I'm going to leave that hanging there for a second. Alice Walker, who wrote A Color Purple, among many, many other things, about 10 years or so after the movie had come out, A Color Purple, with Steven Spielberg, I read everything that Alice Walker's ever written. I just love Alice Walker. She wrote an autobiography called The Same River Twice, about her deep depression when that movie came out and the hate mail she got, particularly from black people. Because because part of the story focused on the man who abused women in that, and Danny Glover played the story, and it's like dirty laundry got aired because, black men do it too, it's kind of out there in a particular way. And I don't have the quote with me, but her quote was so, these are the people, she said, these are the people I love more than anybody. And to get that kind of hate mail, there was no space. And I tell you that because she talks about the story is about redemption. Color Purple is about redemption. I've heard her say it, right? She said, actually, you follow the story all the way to Yen. He's brought back into the fold. He reconciled. He was held accountable. And he was redeemed, right? Liam, what do we do? Do we just cut people off like right here like this? I'm really interested in that reconciliation, the accountability, the redemption, right? Because I don't know, I wish that I could say that I've gone through most of my years and I've made no mistakes. I've never hurt anybody. I've never hurt anybody's feelings. I've never insulted anyone. I'm just saying. I think I try really hard, but I know I've messed up. So how do we do that? How do we reconcile 400 years? What do we say to American Indians? I want to go back to it because really, whose land we stole. why it's complicated, because Eve talks about settlers, natives, and slaves. She said there's a trifecta here in this country. And some of us occupy all those categories. Everybody's complicit. Not in the same way, it's complicated, but settlers, slaves, and native. How do we hold that, knowing that we've done these things to each other? We continue to do them. What does it mean to show up to somebody and say, I'm sorry. I'd like to get to know you now, so is there space for that? How do we do that? Because we can't change what we've done, but we damn sure can own up to what it is. Because we want to move on. We're saying we want something different. And we can't get to kumbaya without doing the hard work in between. So that's really, and part of it is deep listening. What does it mean to listen? What does it mean to, when somebody says to me, I don't see color. Right. You know, my eyes start to move. I do a Linda Blair, my head's spinning around, you know. What I know is, because I've had that, especially when I was young, and white friends, and I knew what they meant. I knew at the core, at least for when I was a kid, that it was, you're like me and I love you anyway, right? I knew that's what it was, but it always made me angry, and I could never articulate it when I was younger, because if you don't see all of this, then you don't know all of this. Anymore, if I said it to anybody in this room, it'd be like, I don't see who you are, right? And it would be very different to say, like, well, you know, I want to see you. I see you. I don't know everything. What is it? I know I keep using you because you're right there. You look good, you know. But, you know, what does it mean to actually do that? What does it mean to do our own internal work? It's nobody's job to teach you who you need to be. So how do we do our own internal assessment of our own capacities? How are we truthful about our own capacity in terms of our bias, our prejudice, our racism? They're all not the same, but I think they're all related. You know, I'm not here to tell anybody what they are or they're not, except to say that I believe we're all biased. Beyond that, it's not my job, and I don't know you well enough, and I want you to like me, so I wouldn't do that either. You know what I'm saying? I'm a guest in your house. What does it mean for us to own that? How do we get better at actually speaking to each other and saying these things? And if you say something that insults me, that actually I give you the benefit of the doubt that you didn't mean it. You know, I spent years living in Nepal, in the Himalaya. I love Nepal, that's the whole thing. One day I was with with a white woman who was an American like myself, and we were walking down the streets, and this young Nepali man, they were like maybe teenagers, suddenly walking by me, and I'm not going to say the word, but he pointed at me and said, look, there's the N-word. He said the N-word. He said it really like he was saying, look, there's a lollipop. Like I knew he didn't speak English, he didn't know what he was saying. The white friend with me lost her mind, right? Because I know all the stuff was coming up for her, like, oh my God, 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 oh my God. You know, like all of it was coming up, right? And I said to her, I said, he doesn't know it. He probably saw that in a movie. I can tell he doesn't have any idea what that means. And actually, I felt weird about it, and we didn't have a conversation, but I can't hold it against him because I don't actually know, like, what was that? And maybe if we had a time to stop and talk. When I was young and really had it going on, I'm older and have expanded a little bit, but I was walking in the streets of New York City, and I used to be an actor for a lot of years, and I was wearing this like the 80s. I had on this like little tight skirt. I thought I looked good. I was going to an audition, and a young black man, I'm walking, and he's like, hey, sister, how much are you?
Oh, Lord.
Yes. Right? And I stopped dead in my truck because I thought I looked good, right? You know, so I was like, I'm not trying to look, you know, whatever. And I stopped and I said to him, and we had a conversation. And it was one of the times because I just said he was young, and then, you know, and I went, you know, that really hurt my feelings. And he was like, what's just happening now? You know? And we talked for a few minutes, and it's not that this is always going to happen, but he apologized. I said, it's okay, you know. But what if we did that? I mean, I know it's a lot of work, but that's what I would say, because it's a lot of work. For me, it's a practice. It's not something we do on Sundays. It's not something we do after school. It's not something we do just in the morning when we get up and we're meditating. It is 24/7. It's a practice. I increase my awareness. I understand that I'm going to make mistakes. I love myself, and I never forget my humanity as it is for others. What do I need to do? And who am I willing to ask, knowing that they may turn me down? You know what? They may turn you down. That doesn't mean you don't keep showing up. So you got me started, Ray. Hi, what's your name?
Nishan.
Nishan.
Thank you.
Sorry.
It makes me think of, it's kind of a consciousness and a connectedness too.
Yes.
And when you were talking, I'm one of those black people that don't do the outdoors. I don't do bugs. I don't do farms, rivers, valleys, none of it. But the older I get,
We're diverse.
I'm sorry, I'm trying not to take a long walk here. Yeah. But the more I start to see and live and understand, I know there's a need for that.
Yes.
Right? But I can also understand why it is so hard, or seems to be so hard for so many black people, when you're kind of born into a disconnectedness from this land, right? Like, we weren't native to this land, and since we've been here, we've been treated as other. But we are here, yeah. Right? So accepting that and understanding the importance of that, and so I'm not really sure what my question is.
Yeah.
But I'm just trying to figure, how do you make resonance of that? So, go ahead.
I've got Magic Mike right here, right? Thank you. Part of it is, what stories are we telling? So one of the things is, if we were having a big workshop, and the first exercise I'd have everybody in here do, we'd have to do a short version of it, is to write a very short couple of pages, your own environmental autobiography, which means you can't get it wrong. But you sort of talk about, where you're from, whatever that means to you, your family, whatever that means to you, your community, your sense of how you develop your perspective, and your own set of biases about environment and place and nature. So one of the things I want to say, and I totally appreciate, I don't like bugs either, I just want you to know, that, and I was telling Bennett earlier today, I said that one of the challenges I think we have in this country, that often when we talk about nature, we frame it as, no, but we all do it because we've all been trained this way. It's humans and it's nature, right? As opposed to thinking that we're actually part of nature, which changes the conversation. The other is that we're often told that nature, for me, it's framed as nature as we see through the lens of recreation, or nature as a supermarket of resources for our use. Right? So we don't think about it in terms of labor, people who work the land. We don't think about it necessarily in terms of spirit, people who may engage primarily through spirit, whatever that is, religion, spirit, whatever that is, with non-human nature. There's all these other ways that you can be in a strong relationship with nature outside of that framing, right? Which then changes it, because I know you in relationship. Even if you don't like bugs, right? It's not, you don't have to be camping, you don't have to go hiking. You don't have to do those things to be able to see the value in that relationship and helping to protect that and make space for and access to for everyone to be able to show up in that way, right?
Daryl Shelton.
Hi, Daryl Shelton.
Fascinating presentation. Enjoyed it a lot, and particularly struck by the fact it draws on a lot of disciplines,
yes.
History, sociology, literature, a number of things.
Yes.
If I were to hear this presentation and someone asked me from what discipline did the presenter come, geographer might be low on the list of my guesses.
That's okay.
So could you talk a little bit about the connection of geography to this? What drew you to geography?
Yeah.
And maybe enlighten us or enlighten me a little bit on this thing called the new geography.
I don't know if I can. So, okay. I don't know about that last piece, but so yes, I am purposefully interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary. I don't call myself an academic, so I need to be really clear with everybody about this. I was 11 years as a professional actor. I really live in the arts. I took 5 years. I backpacked around the world and saved my money. I kept working, saving money, and backpacked in different parts of the world. I returned to school in my mid-30s to do my BA, which was in Washington State, at Western Washington, Fairhaven, where you could design your own degree. And I went and lived on a women's farm in Kenya for 6 months, and then did my BA was on like women's economic development. Then I did my master's at Utah State. I'm telling you all this to see, so you to understand the interdisciplinarity. Utah State, it was in the sociology department where my dissertation was on community forest management and gender in Nepal. And I wasn't going to get a PhD. And then somebody said, you should get a PhD, because you'll be like a black woman with a PhD. And you'll have a lot more. And I went, you know what? That makes sense. And I'll just borrow more money. Why not? But what's it going to be? And the problem, one of my many challenges, I should say, with academia was how, even though life is complex and complicated and overlapping and messy, it silos everything into discipline. And I understand from the practice of having to focus, but I resist it so much. So when I was looking at disciplines, for a minute I thought anthropology, because but anthropology's got a funky history, as does every discipline. But there was something about anthropology that was missing for me, and somebody looked at my schedule and said, you've got a lot of classes cross-listed with geography. And I said, oh, that's just true. And they said, why don't you consider geography? I'm like, what is geography? And a geography professor said, it's what people do it's why people do what they do where they do it. And geographers like to say everything is geographical. And I kind of like that, right? So that's why I went to geography. I also, because it gave a sense of being interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary. The challenge is, remember I told you I come from the arts? I also have sort of a political stance about work being accessible, what kind of knowledge counts, how we're supposed to talk about it and sound scholarly, the ways in which that can limit who can participate, right? And my natural inclination is to tell story, because especially around this stuff that is so hard to talk about, really, my intention is to get you to lean in, whether or not to get you to agree with me, but just to lean in. So there's a way to communicate that. There's no discipline that does that on its own, right? And so I had to remove myself from academia and stand outside and be in a relationship with it. I used to say, I don't want to play in the sandbox. I want to play on the beach. So that's the best I can do. I love doing geography. That's my doctorate. Yay, geography. And I don't say I'm any one thing, because that's really limited. And yeah, we can kind of get into the history of people trying to tell me I'm only one thing because of my gender, because of the color of my skin, all those things. But my dad, just because he was my dad, I'm just like, nobody's telling me I'm any one thing. I want to think about the complexity of those things and how they're in relationship with each other. So yeah, I purposefully sort of grab, because that's also just the way my mind works, but I'm grabbing at all of that because it all counts. It all has value, right? I'm not sure what the new geography is. That sounds like that should be the new geography, but I don't know. And, I was in the geography department at UK for 3 years, but before that, I was in environmental science, policy, and management at Berkeley for 8 years. I mean, it was an interdisciplinary department on these issues. So if I'm going to be in a relationship with academia, that's what it is. So I'm doing a 2-year residency at Middlebury College in their environmental studies department, but we created that together, a proposal. I said, I don't want a tenure track job. I don't want, because it locks me in to doing a thing a certain way, and I'm trying to get at what's emergent. So how can we still be in good relationship and make space for what's emergent? Does that make sense?
I'm sorry to cut in to say that we are truly at the end of
We're
our
all locked up in here.
time.
We're going to have to be here all night
Thank
together.
Carolyn Finney, and thanks to all of you.
This has been a Metro TV production.